I had the good fortune of growing up in Adidam. My parents became students of Adidas when I was 3 years old, and they moved to the Mountain of Attention Sanctuary in Northern California. And so throughout my childhood, I attended Adidam schools that used much of the wisdom instruction that Adida was giving devotees about how to rear children. And it was a very magical way to come up. Had the graceful opportunity to see him regularly throughout the childhood and to experience his tremendous humor and love and embrace of the children who were living nearby him. And so as I grew up, I always had an absolute certainty about the divine. It was completely evident when I would see him and when we would have the opportunity to sit with him formally. And there would be the occasional opportunity to actually relate to him physically, where he would come and embrace the children who were present at the Mountain of Attention Sanctuary. So this was quite a magical way to grow up. It was full of heart feeling and full of love and full of tremendous wisdom about life. At the same time, I had the experience that I think is very common to all people, which is at a certain age, usually in the midst of adolescence, to rebel and react against the way you've been brought up. And at the age of 15 or so, I began to feel that way and had the opportunity to attend other schools that were not affiliated with Adidam and to begin to explore all the sorts of experiences that I had been desiring and wondering about throughout my childhood and early adolescence. And so I threw myself into that pretty intensively and passionately and very much enjoyed it. The experiences of spending time with girls, the experience of experimenting with various things that made me feel good, enjoying certain different sorts of education than what I had come up with. And so this lasted for about a year's period of time. And then abruptly on my 16th birthday, I sat down for dinner and I started to hemorrhage through my nose. And so I went into the other room and put my head back and pinched my nose, and 5 minutes, 10 minutes, still the bleeding wouldn't stop. It continued to go down the back of my throat, and at a certain point, my parents realized that this was more serious than a typical nosebleed, and so they took me to the hospital. And after a series of tests, they determined that I had a tumor in my head that had been growing there for a few years. And it was located behind my eye and pressing up against my brain and the carotid artery. And they said it was actually very fortunate that it had eaten through a small vessel in the nose and created this bleeding, because within a couple of weeks they said it would have eaten through the carotid artery and I would have simply bled to death internally without knowing what had happened. So after another series of tests, they determined that they were going to try to operate on this tumor and to remove it. And they gave me a 50% chance of surviving it, and they told me that I would never see out of this eye, my right eye again, that I would have no feeling in the right side of my face thereafter, and that they would have to do radiation therapy on it after the period of the operation, which would result in loss of hair and so forth. So Adidam was informed about this condition, and he was in the Fiji Islands at the time. I was living in California, and he started to send very specific instructions about just my orientation throughout the whole process, my attention on him throughout the process, and he clearly was keeping his blessing attention on me for the week or so that was leading up to the operation, which occurred on New Year's Eve. Every day he would ask for a report. And every day I felt more and more certain that the result of this operation was going to be positive. And so on the 31st of December, the operation took place. It was 14 hours long. And I remember waking up from the general anesthesia being very groggy, and my mother was there at the side of the gurney as they were bringing me to consciousness in the operating room. And then they started to wheel me back to the recovery room, and she said, "You did it, you did it." And the first words out of my mouth was, "No, Adidam did it." And there was absolute certainty of this in the waking up process. It wasn't something that had a lot of thought associated with it, because I was so groggy from being unconscious for so many hours and had gone through such a extreme operation. But it was an absolute tacit certainty that his blessing had been influencing the operation. And the surgeons reported afterwards that they were amazed by how well the operation had gone, that they were able to remove the entire tumor, which they hadn't expected was going to be possible, that I was able to still see out of my right eye, and then there was a full recovery that happened very quickly thereafter. And I knew full well that this was largely to do with the mysterious spiritual blessing that Adidam had been giving to me throughout this whole process. And at the same time, within a period of a couple of weeks, I was back to all of my same tricks and patterns and impulses. And so then this lasted for the next couple of years. Well, how old was I? 16. So this then lasted for the next year and a half or so. I continued with the high school and then graduated, and then started to attend college, and was attending college and studying art history at the time. And out of the blue, I received a question from Adidam, who still was living in Fiji, that was delivered to me by telephone from a friend, because these are in the days before email. And he said, "Adidam is just wondering what it is you're doing with your life right now." And so I felt like I had a very good report for him. I told him about how I was attending university and studying art history and so forth. And then another week or two passed, and then I received a communication again from this friend, who passed on Adidam's summary response to the extensive report I had written. And he simply said, "Tell Stanley he's living like a fool." And I knew full well he was absolutely right. I had absolutely no question about it. And yet I still persisted in my studies, in my desires, in my impulse to fulfillment and stimulation. And yet, with everything that I did, I would hear this thundering voice: "He's living like a fool. He's living like a fool." And there was absolutely no denying it. He had undressed what I found so attractive about desire and fulfillment and experience with that simple phrase, such that with everything I did, it was evident that it was not it. It was not the truth. It was not reality. At a certain point, a couple months had passed since he said this, and I realized I couldn't go on with what I was doing further, that what I needed to do was to go on retreat in his hermitage in the Fiji Islands. And so I stopped attending school after that semester, and I moved back up to Northern California, where he has a sanctuary, the Mountain of Attention. And I began the process of preparation to go on retreat in his hermitage ashram in Fiji. And this is a process that took much more than I expected. There was a period of tremendous purification and alignment that I had to go through in order to be prepared to come into his company and to make the most of that experience. And I struggled with that tremendously. There were numerous times where I felt like I just couldn't do it any longer, that I would return to school, that I would do something else. And yet I was able to stay focused in that process, and ultimately I was able to go to Fiji. And at that time I felt so one-pointed in my passion to see him, to experience his spiritual blessing, and to have the revelation of clarity and direction to my life given. That was my prayer in going to his feet. And so when I arrived on the island, I had the opportunity to sit with him the next day. And the moment that I sat down in his company for a formal sitting, and he came out and sat down, I knew with absolute certainty that I had come home, that I was in a place of absolute trust, absolute truth, and absolute clarity, and that there was this feeling of perfect love being communicated by my spiritual master, by Adidam, that my heart was always yearning for. And I realized that that's where I wanted to spend the rest of my life, in his company, serving him. And shortly thereafter, he did invite me to live there in the Fiji Islands with him and to serve him, and to then more and more over the years attend to him quite closely in my service and travel with him. And he's really then, since that time, revealed a whole life of service, and one that I'm tremendously grateful for.